logistics, as I think many of you are aware, we'll run it similarly, where the first 45 minutes roughly will be Christian's presentation, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience for about 15 minutes, and then after that, everybody except the committee will leave for another set of questions. So, my great pleasure to introduce Christian Bhakta. He is a ME PhD, doing his final thesis defense after 5 years here at Georgia Tech. He started after he graduated from New Mexico Tech in 2016, where he joined the ME PhD program and has primarily been working on our powered knee ankle prosthesis project over the course of the last 5 years, which he'll be talking about in his defense. Over this last year, he's also worked on our DOE Sandia project, which has been fun for those who might want to hear about it. He can talk to you separately, but those have been his major projects here. And Christian's done a really great job. He's got now multiple papers on throughout most of his aims on each of these topics, specifically looking into using machine learning systems on our device to do amputee intent recognition, to recognize the world more continuously, such as looking at walking speed or slope, incline, angle, which has been pretty cool, including running real-time experiments on those with machine learning systems. One of the things I want to highlight about what I think Christian's done such a great job here is in his mentorship for undergrads. I think his BIP team has been really successful. So right when he started, I think within about a year, he started a BIP team. That very first year, his team won the robotics division of the VIP competition, and then more, I think even bigger. A couple years later, his team competed in the VIP video innovation competition. And Christian was very closely mentored that team and helped them through this process, where his team won the Georgia Tech robotics and overall team, and went on to win both the Southwest regional competition and the international VIP competition, which is a big deal. So won at 3 different stages for what has been some very cool videos that he's put together that has been very helpful. Allowed us to use them a lot in different contexts, and his project has been featured quite a few times on news media and other aspects that have really helped, I think, establish sort of the prestige of the lab over the last 5 years through his project. So we're very grateful to Christian. He's also been a really great manager of the lab and helping everybody keep together, placing all of everybody's orders and other things. So been a very good team player over the last few years, and we're going to miss him. And I'm excited today to hear all about his final set of research aims and the completion of an experiment that we've been trying to do for years, and he finally got through back just a month ago. All right, Christian, with that, take it over.
Thank you, Aaron. Hello, everyone. My name is Christian Bhakta. I'm a PhD candidate in the Exoskeleton and Intelligent Controls Lab. And today I'm going to be talking to you about how to improve intelligence of robotic lower limb prostheses to enhance mobility for individuals with limb loss. First, I'll talk about the background of current prosthetic technology, go into the research aims of my doctoral studies, and end with final remarks and takeaways that I have learned over the years. First, over the next several decades, the number of individuals with transfemoral amputation will increase to approximately 1.6 million people. The major causes stem from trauma, cancer, and congenital reasons. There are many challenges associated with amputation. They range from reduced mobility, increased energetic demands, all the way to even certain social effects. There's an overall need to improve the quality of life. Many individuals with transfemoral amputation or above knee amputation tend to walk with asymmetrical gait patterns. This ranges from different step lengths and increased compensatory strategies that have to be employed. Furthermore, these individuals have an increased burden on their intact joints, specifically at the hip. And these asymmetries have been led to correlate with metabolic expenditure, and specifically, transfemoral amputees expend up to 60% more energy compared to able-bodied individuals. So what type of devices are currently available in today's market? Most commercial devices are purely passive components, which do not have the capabilities of providing net positive work. There are semi-active devices, but these only provide variable damping during downslopes and downstairs walking. And there are only a few commercially available powered prostheses, which include the Össur Power Knee and the Ottobock Empower, but that are still not predominantly used. Although this technology is moving forward to using powered assistance, it is still not known how to effectively provide this power. Most of the research-grade devices feature motorized or electromechanical actuators to assist at both the knee and ankle joints. There's ongoing research in the field being performed to understand and effectively provide this assistance to users across different locomotion modes. Specifically, in our lab, we've developed two powered knee and ankle prostheses. The first on the left is the Epic leg, or our first generation leg, which was a collaboration with the Amber Lab at Caltech. And the second is the open source leg, originally designed and made open source by the Neurobionics Lab at the University of Michigan. My team and I were able to manufacture and machine both of these devices in-house here at Georgia Tech using the help of the machine shop. Both of these devices feature a total of 6 wearable sensors, which include encoders, load cell, and IMUs. Throughout my talk, I'll describe multiple studies that have used both of these devices. In order to see this type of technology go from a research lab setting to community use, there are several steps that I think are needed for these devices to go and be useful. Here's a roadmap of what I believe are the necessary steps to reach this end goal. First is the hardware. You need to have a device that can provide high torques while maintaining a low weight profile and sustain loads for long periods of time. Next, from a controls perspective, you need to have intuitive and adaptive strategies that can dynamically adjust to the user. And lastly, it is useful to understand the impact of these active devices on the intact joints and whether these devices can improve clinical measures such as gait symmetry. With the development of these 3 blocks, clinical acceptance can be reached, and the overall goal of having a device that is easy to use, robust to different walking patterns, and is durable. And the focus of my PhD studies has been mostly enhancing and developing these intelligent controllers for these devices. The control paradigm that we typically fits into 3 tiers: the high level, the mid-level, and low-level controller. Our high-level controller is concerned with detecting user intent, such as walking in different ambulation modes, or estimating other environmental variables, such as walking speed or ground slope. This informs the mid-level controller, which is responsible for generating desired torque profiles. It uses an impedance control lock that has tunable parameters. We couple this with a finite state machine at each joint, where we can break apart the cyclic nature of walking into 4 distinct phases. And lastly, the low-level controller is responsible for matching the desired torque and actual torque outputted by our actuator. And again, the focus of this dissertation will primarily focus on enhancing these high-level controllers. To give a broad overview of the prior innovations made in intent recognition, I will go over several strategies that have been tested in the last several decades. One of the first ever techniques developed was echo control, where they took signals from the intact limb and played them on the prosthetic leg. However, the disadvantages of this method is that you always have to take even steps or even start with a sound limb. Another method explored was direct prediction, which uses sensors such as a camera or distance sensor to directly measure a stair height or inclination angle. However, these methods suffer from calibration issues and increased processing time. There's been volitional control, which uses embedded EMG sensors in the prosthetic socket to track certain patterns associated with certain tasks. In this case, showing how you can extend and flex the knee or extend and flex the ankle. And lastly, indirect prediction that has been gaining traction where machine learning or pattern recognition systems are used to make a prediction of what is to come. And this has been seen in typically two forms, classification and regression. Specifically now, I will focus on taking you through the key innovations made on intent recognition systems for powered devices in the context of locomotion mode classification. The first major innovation was employing phase-specific classifiers compared to just one model. In 2010, this work was expanded where it was the first real-time user-dependent system that was applied to a powered prosthesis using mechanical sensors. And what I mean by user-dependent is that the model was trained with only that user-specific data. In 2014, time history methods were developed by Young et al. To improve the steady-state classification error. And steady-state steps meaning that you stay within the same locomotion mode. This showed much better comparison compared to no time history methods. In 2015, Hargrove et al. Built upon this and made a real-time user-dependent classifier that used both EMG and mechanical sensors, and also paired the time history methods seen in 2014. In 2016, there was two key findings. The first was that you can make mode-specific classifiers, and secondly, you can make this implementation of a user-independent classifier or intent recognition system. And in this method, the model is trained with a pool of subjects and evaluated on the novel subject. And lastly, delayed mode transitions, which was shown in 2017, to improve and allow for these classifiers to gain richer information without impeding the user. Next, I will highlight some of the key research findings that have explored methods of detecting the environment in the context of walking speed and ground slope. However, there have not been many studies that have explored continuous estimation of these environmental variables in powered devices. It has been more commonly seen in wearable sensors and exoskeleton studies. One of the first studies ever done was to explore the direct integration of a foot IMU sensor to calculate walking speed in able-bodied individuals. Stopp et al. In 2011 took these similar direct integration methods and were able to estimate slope with one subject walking on this powered prosthesis. However, both of these methods require at least one gait cycle to update in order to output an estimation. In 2013, Hu et al. Showed that adding a kinematic model for specific users could enhance and estimate these speeds. And in 2019, Kang et al. Showed that adding EMG information could improve the speed and slope estimations when using a hip exo. And finally, this was one of the first studies done in 2019 where Robotic et al. Showed that using a single shank IMU, they could estimate walking speed for individuals with transfemoral amputation. Hopefully by now, you can see that there are many key findings that have been made, but there are still some key research gaps present. First, there have been many dependent offline studies, but not too many studies that have explored user-independent strategies. Although it has been seen that user-dependent models can be run in real time, there has been no real-time user-independent system that has been done solely using mechanical sensors. Third, there has been no studies exploring how well these user-dependent and independent models can generalize to different grades of context, for example, different stair heights or inclination angles. Next is that not many studies have used continuous estimation of their intent recognition systems, as previous methods require at least once per gait cycle update in order to make that estimation. And lastly, there's been no real-time tiered intent recognition system where a controller first predicts deambulation mode and then subsequently predicts and estimates an environmental variable like ground slope. And my dissertation has focused on addressing some of these key gaps in the field. In order to implement these devices into the community more, the overall goal is to identify user intent, adjust control strategies for assisting the user during durable community ambulation. The primary research goals are to create new frameworks of intent recognition systems that can be used either discretely or continuously to decipher user needs. Lastly, these intent recognition systems must be deployed in real time to show proper validation that these devices can outperform current prosthetic technology. With this framework in mind, my central hypothesis is that continuous estimation using wearable sensors coupled with machine learning can enhance prosthetic controllers to sync assistance with the user compared to passive devices. I will accomplish this through 4 aims, where aims 1 and 2 look to develop offline frameworks of mode classification and walking speed estimation, and aim 3, which is looking at combining this information learned from these previous 2 aims into creating a real-time intent recognition system that can scale across multiple contexts. And lastly, aim 4 is looking at the biomechanical validations between powered and passive prostheses. With this in mind, the first aim is focused on how to improve mode classification algorithms. The main objective here is to develop, optimize, validate machine learning algorithms to predict ambulation modes using sensor fusion and signal processing techniques. We had 2 main hypotheses in this study, where the first was using a more complex machine learning algorithm could improve the classification accuracy across different grades of terrain. And secondly, the addition of wearable sensors could improve both user-dependent and user-independent classifiers. In this experimental protocol, we fit 8 individuals with our first generation leg. This leg features, again, multiple wearable sensors, which include encoders, a load cell, and IMU. We asked them to walk at 2 types of locomotion circuits, a stair and a ramp, and we asked them to do this over 4 different presets, where the stairs range from 10.2 to 17.8 centimeters, and ramps from about 8 degrees to 12 degrees. Here's an example of a user walking with a powered device over 2 different ambulation circuits. In order to train a machine learning model, there must first be a training session. And in this training sessions, users are manually triggered correctly into the different ambulation modes. The data then is labeled appropriately to generate ground truth labels for the machine learning algorithm to learn from. And in each ambulation circuit, there are approximately 10 to 12 steady state steps and 4 transitional steps. Again, steady state steps are where you stay within the same locomotion mode, and transitional steps are where you go from one mode to another. So for example, level walking to stair ascent. And note that there are far fewer transitional steps compared to steady state. We then took this data from the 5 ambulation modes. We combined all the sensor information and segmented them at 2 key gate locations in the gait cycle, at heel contact and toe off. We took these channels and performed a feature extraction to extract useful information from these mechanical sensors. We had a total of 28 channels times these 5 feature types, leading us to a feature table of 140 features. We also then performed a window size sweep to understand how well our prediction would be given a time window before the decision had to be made, in this case, at heel contact or toe off. Additionally, we swept through different tunable hyperparameters for our more complex models to allow them to learn the data better. And lastly, the machine learning model would then output a prediction mode. Now let me get to the results of the study. The results here show steady state error on the left, and on the right, transitional error the steady state error on the left and transitional error on the right. The different colored bars indicate the different models that were evaluated. And note that these results show the average percentage when tested across multiple stair heights and inclination rates. We found that XGBoost had the lowest error compared to any of our other models tested. And one of the reasons that this transitional error might be much higher is because we don't have as many examples to train with compared to our steady state steps. The implication here is that by using these tunable machine learning models, it can lead to reduced classification errors across both user-dependent and independent systems. Lastly, we wanted to understand the impact of each sensor to our classification error. We performed a forward sensor selection where each sensor's data was trained individually in order to understand which sensor was most important. This type of analysis allows us to understand how important the sensor is to a given task. To do this, you remove a specific sensor from your training set and evaluate how well the model performs. The one that shows the highest error implies the most useful sensor. So here on the left shows the dependent system, and on the right shows the independent system. And in each graph, the relative reductions of adding a sensor as you go through. And it was found that in both cases, the load cell was found to be the most important sensor for both dependent and independent systems. Overall, it can be seen that utilizing all available sensors can reduce the classification error by approximately 40% in both systems. And the implication here is that both systems can benefit using these extra sensors. This takes me to the discussion points of this study. The first contribution of this study was that this new complex algorithm was able to outperform previous models studied in prior literature, and it was able to generalize across multiple stair heights and inclination angles. The novelty here was that no other study had done this across a range of these environmental contexts. The second contribution was that it was shown to work well for both user-dependent and independent models. And in accordance to our hypothesis, our first hypothesis was accepted that more complex algorithms do improve the classification accuracy across both dependent and independent systems. And our second hypothesis was also accepted, where we were able to see that the inclusion of additional sensors continually improved model performance for both of these types of classifiers. The findings from this study show that developing user-independent models are feasible and can also generalize across multiple contexts. In the bigger picture, individuals can walk across a variety of tasks and still properly transition into the correct locomotion. This leads me to my next aim, where the focus is now to create a framework that allows us to do a continuous inference of the user. The main objective here is to establish and validate a machine learning framework that can perform continuous speed estimation utilizing the embedded mechanical sensors. We also compared multiple machine learning models to evaluate the performance. We have two main hypotheses in this study. The first being that independent models could achieve similar results to dependent models across different model evaluation schemes. The second hypothesis was that employing phase-specific models will yield lower tracking error compared to just one single continuous model. The rationale here was to use a similar strategy as proposed seen in earlier studies, but in the application of continuous estimation compared to mode prediction. So in this protocol, we had 6 individuals with transfemoral amputation walk on our first generation leg. We asked users to complete 1-minute walking trials, equally spaced from 0.5 to 0.9 meters per second. And we also asked users to perform a dynamic profile to test how well the algorithm could adapt to changes in speed. Now, there are some key differences compared to the machine learning pipeline I had described in AIM-1. And the main difference here is that multiple windows are extracted continuously at a given rate. We first start with the raw data, which contains the information about the sensor channels and the correct phase. Next, we can split this into 4 phases. This was done in either 1, 2, or 4. And the phases are determined by our finite state machine that splits apart the gate cycle into these distinct phases. Lastly, features are extracted using a sliding window of 20 milliseconds to emulate a 50 Hertz update rate. The hyperparameters of these models were also tuned, and a window size was also swept to figure out the optimal values for each algorithm. The final output of this pipeline was to feed it back into the machine learning algorithm that could estimate walking speed. Here are the results from our model comparison when it was coupled with a Kalman filter. On the y-axis here shows the average RMSE across subjects for each model, and the x-axis shows the dependent and independent. And just a reminder that dependent systems are trained with user-specific data, and user-independent systems are trained from a pool of subjects and evaluated on that novel subject. It was found that there was actually a significant difference between dependent and independent models, which is opposite of what we hypothesized in the first place. And we found that the lowest error in the dependent case was our XGBoost model, but in the independent case, that was not necessarily true, where the neural network had outperformed. Secondly, a phase comparison was performed to understand if using a regressor at a specific portion of the gate cycle is more beneficial compared to just one overall. The average RMSE, again, is on the y-axis, and the dashed lines show the independent model's performance, and the solid lines show the dependent models. It can be seen generally that the trend shows that the late stance portion has the best results. However, this was not found to be statistically different compared to running it with a single continuous model. But the trend seems to indicate that there's key information present at specific portions of the gate cycle that can further enhance these models. We then ran a comparison across two different case scenarios, remove one speed and dynamic tracking. The remove one speed was performed to understand how well the model could generalize when missing a subset of data. On the left is the dependent models, and on the right is the independent models. It can be seen that these models are good at interpolation, but struggle during the extrapolated region. What this means is that the middle speeds could easily be estimated compared to the edge cases. Next, we wanted to understand how well these models could adapt to dynamic changes in speed. The solid black line indicates the ground truth, which was the treadmill speed, over time. It can be seen that generally that these models can track decently well with an average RMSE of 0.06 meters per second. The implication of these results are that it is first continuous and that they can adapt to dynamic real-world tasks of users walking at varying speeds versus just steady-state walking. In this study, we were able to develop a machine learning framework that beats only once per gate cycle methods. We validated that this could work across a variety of conditions and that these models could be implemented in real time at an update rate of 50 Hertz. In terms of our hypotheses, the first hypothesis was rejected, where that independent models could not perform similarly to dependent models. And secondly, that phase-specific models did not result in a tracking error. Although there was not a statistical difference, the trend showed that maybe employing models at specific phases could improve the estimate. The findings from this study show that these models can be run continuously, which allows for control parameters to adjust immediately compared to once per gate cycle estimates. These methods can also track dynamic movements, which enhance individuals to walk more comfortably with the device, and that it can adapt quickly to them. Finally, this is one of the first studies exploring continuous user-independent intent recognition systems for powered prostheses. This concludes my second aim, and now the third aim is a culmination of the prior two aims, but in the focus being of implementing these models in real time. The main objective here was to validate that these intent recognition systems could be implemented in real time, as well as coupled with scaling the parameters across different environmental contexts. The novelty here is that we're running a real-time tiered intent recognition system that does prediction and estimation. There were two main hypotheses. The first was that real-time error will perform worse than offline error. Similar trends have been seen in previous literature. In addition, we hypothesized that the relative improvement from offline to real-time error would be worse for user-independent models than user-dependent models. And lastly, we hypothesized that in general, user-independent models perform worse compared to user-dependent models, as we've seen in the previous two aims results. Before jumping into how we created these real-time intent recognition systems, I want to explain how we scaled assistance as a function of the environment. At the mid-level controller, we use this impedance control law. We can add equations that smooth the behavior between phases. We have performed a study to analyze the effects of which parameters change across subjects as can be seen in this green highlighted text. In this study, we looked at between level walking, ramp ascent, and ramp descent. However, none of these equations implemented here scaled as a function of the environmental variable, where it could change depending on speed, slope, or stair height. We used an open source data set created by one of my colleagues, Dr. Camargo. This data set provides the locomotion biomechanics across different walking speeds, ramp angles, and stair heights. Specifically, we investigated how we could create scaling equations that would follow similar patterns seen in able-bodied individuals. One example of scaling that we did is for ramp ascent, where we looked into the kinematics, kinetics, and power profiles of the knee joint. Here, it can be seen that the knee moment increases as the slope angle increases. We took this information and made a scaling equation that would adjust the impedance parameter appropriately. So this moves into the experimental protocol that we ran. In this study, we had 10 individuals with unilateral amputation walk over ramps and a treadmill. The study utilized the open source leg, and this was a two-part study where we had a training session and a real-time session. In the training session, we asked individuals to repeat similar protocols as seen in my previous two aims, where we had them walk at different presets for ramps and different speeds on the treadmill. In the real-time session for ramp circuits, we asked them to walk for a total of 13 circuits, which included both ramp and level walking trials. And we had them repeat this process 2 times, one for each dependent and independent models, so that we could do a comparison. And the order of which model was run for all these subjects was randomized. In the speed portion of this real-time session, we had them do 2 dynamic profiles, and we tested 3 different machine learning models. Here we added a semi-independent model, which takes the baseline independent model and adds a little bit of information from the novel subject. So I want to emphasize the novelty of this real-time intent recognition system is that this is the first user-independent system to be run, and also the first tiered intent recognition system to be run, which means it first does mode prediction and then continuous estimation of slope. If the system can correctly identify the ramp modes, it will subsequently make a prediction of slope, which will update the scaling equation that is implemented at the mid-level controller. The video here shows a user walking with the real-time intent recognition system. And the main difference here is that compared to the training session, where before the researcher would have to manually trigger them into the correct mode, in this system, it will automatically change the locomotion mode when it predicts a new mode. And it's doing this through its embedded microprocessor or Raspberry Pi on the open source leg. This allows for users to seamlessly walk between modes without any exaggerated motion. Similarly, we did this for our treadmill protocol. And the novelty of this system is that this is the first real-time user-independent system employed for continuous estimation of walking speed for individuals using powered prostheses. We had individuals walk at 2 different dynamic profiles, a staircase profile and a trapezoid profile, to understand how well the model could scale to these changes in speed. And in this video, it shows the subject starting off at a slow speed and slowly ramping up following the staircase trajectory. Now let me show you some of the results that we found from running our real-time intent recognition system, specifically for mode classification. The graphs here show offline results in blue and in real-time results in green. The solid lines indicate the dependent models, and the striped lines show the independent models. We ran a statistical test, and we found a difference between the real-time and offline error. This led us to look more into what were the relative differences between offline and real-time error for each model. The way we calculated this is we used this equation here, where we looked at it for both dependent systems and independent systems. And there's quite a large difference between these models. And it was found to be statistically different, which indicates that independent models scale well from offline to real-time. The implication here is that if we can reduce the offline independent error, we should see similar results in real-time. Now here are the results for our slope real-time intent recognition system. On the y-axis, it shows the average RMSE of estimating the slope in terms of degrees. And again, the blue bars here show offline and the green bars show real-time. We were only able to show a statistical difference between the real-time and offline error for the dependent models. And again, the implication here is that if we can reduce the offline independent error, then we should see a similar result in real time. And lastly, from our results from our real-time tests with walking speed. The addition in this plot is that we have an extra bar, which shows the semi-independent model that was also run, which is in a checkered pattern. On the y-axis shows the average RMSE as a function of in meters per second of walking speed. And after running a two-way ANOVA, there was a significant difference between real-time and offline errors across models. And on average, we got errors of about 0.1 meters per second for both dependent and independent systems. Here's also an example of one of the tracking plots for a staircase profile that we ran. This was a subject-independent model and also showed one of the better results that we achieved during our real-time testing, where we were able to achieve an average RMSE of 0.0658. This brings me to the contributions of this study. The first contribution is that we developed the first real-time user-independent recognition system using power prostheses that used only mechanical sensors. Secondly, we built a tiered intent recognition system that would first do mode prediction coupled with continuous estimation. And lastly, we found that the user-independent models show smaller differences between offline and real-time error compared to user-dependent models. In terms of our hypotheses, our first hypothesis was accepted that we in general saw that real-time errors were worse than offline errors, specifically in mode prediction and speed estimation. Secondly, we found actually the opposite result here, which indicates that user-independent models show similar results from offline to real-time. And lastly, our second hypothesis was rejected, where user-independent models did not necessarily perform worse than user-dependent models. And the larger impact of these results show that developing user-independent models can generalize from offline to real-time. This also means that this does not require extra training sessions for each user to deploy these models. And this is one step closer to making these systems generalizable to the general population. This concludes my third aim, and lastly, I will discuss the biomechanical evaluation between powered and passive prostheses. The main objective here is to quantify the performance of active devices compared to passive devices for commonly seen clinical measures. There were two main hypotheses here, where the first was that we could scale assistance as a function of the locomotion context, and this will outperform controllers that use static parameters, which should induce a more symmetric gait. And secondly, that power prostheses can reduce the intact side joint work needed compared to passive devices. In order to understand the effects of these devices, we need to create biomechanical models. We used our motion capture system in our lab to collect marker data and force plates, and we used OpenSim, an open source biomechanics platform that computes inverse kinematics and dynamics. We created custom models that incorporated mass and inertial properties to get more accurate results compared to just able-bodied individual models. On the left here shows the OpenSim models with our first generation leg and the passive leg, and on the right shows it with our open source leg. And this was done for both left and right sides. And I'll go through now discussing three protocols where we performed biomechanical evaluations using our powered prosthetic devices. Our first protocol was doing stair ambulation across stair heights with our first generation leg. Secondly, was doing treadmill walking across different speeds using the open source leg. And lastly, doing sloped walking with the open source leg as well. In this first protocol, we had individuals walk with the active prostheses across 4 different presets. Here's an animation of individuals walking with the device in a step-over-step gait pattern in stair ascent. Similarly, they use their passive device to walk upstairs. However, the key difference here is that this was step-to-step gait due to the lack of positive power from their passive device. With this biomechanics pipeline, we were able to create energy distribution plots across the lower limb joints for both the prosthetic and intact sides. Here, I show the energy distribution for individuals when they use the active device and passive device for stair ascent. The yellow, orange, and green colors indicate the prosthesis side, and the shades of blue indicate the intact side. It can be seen that the active device reduces the overall stair ascent energetic cost, which was shown to be statistically different. Additionally, the use of powered prostheses allowed for less energy to be required to ascend the stair compared to a passive device. And lastly, that the active device could improve the energy distribution across the lower limbs, which could lead to improved gait symmetry. The next protocol that we ran was to look at how to effectively scale assistance as a function of walking speed. This video here shows an individual walking with a dynamically changing walking speed profile, as seen on the bottom right. And we scaled the ankle stiffness as a function of this speed. And in this case, the impedance parameter that was used was the ankle stiffness parameter. You can generally see that as the speed increases in this triangular fashion, so does the impedance parameter. The plots here show the unscaled versus scaled assistance. It can be seen that the scaled assistance leads to better timing of the plantar flexion torque compared to the unscaled version. And this results show for n equals 3. Furthermore, the peak moment scales more naturally as a function of walking speed. Where at lower speeds, you don't have a jerky burst of power, but at higher speeds, you can increase the amount of peak torque proportionally. And in here, the purple lines show the scaled peak moments, and the blue shows the unscaled across these three subjects. The last protocol I want to talk to you about is scaling assistance as a function of ramp terrain. As a reminder, we took the biological torque profiles from the able-bodied dataset and created a scaling equation that would adjust the knee extension moment in early stance as a function of ground slope. We scaled the knee extension moment by adjusting the stiffness parameter of the knee in the early stance portion. With a similar biomechanics pipeline, we were able to generate similar energy pie charts that were created for individuals walking with active and passive devices on ramp ascent. Here, I show the positive energy distribution for individuals when they used the active, which is shown on the left, and the passive device shown on the right. Again, the yellow, orange, and green bars show the prosthesis side, and the shades of blue show the intact side. Overall, it can be seen again that the device reduces the overall energetic cost needed in ramp ascent. And furthermore, it was able to reduce the hip joint work needed compared to the passive device. With this, I'm going to wrap up and show you the contributions of these studies. First, we showed that we could modulate the torque as a function of the environmental context. We could improve gait biomechanics, leading to more symmetric behaviors. And in terms of our hypothesis, the first hypothesis was accepted as there is evidence showing that a more even distribution between the prosthesis and the intact side when they use the active device. The second hypothesis was also accepted, and we saw a statistical difference of the reduction of the intact side knee joint, specifically in stair ascent, and a reduction of the intact side hip joint in ramp ascent. The impacts of these findings suggest that modulating assistance parameters leads to better timing and acceptance of these devices. It allows for individuals to walk at whatever comfortable pace that they want to and adapt as needed. Another big impact of using power devices is that it can help reduce intact side loading, which is important to reduce the effects of joint degradation and increase effort required during these common walking tasks. This ends my final aim, and now I want to talk to you about the final conclusions. The original roadmap I proposed was that through these main categories, we can make these devices more usable in real-world applications. Hopefully, through this work, by making these controllers more intelligent, we're closer to clinical acceptance of these powered devices. The overall goal was to improve quality of life. Throughout the multiple studies conducted, we hope to have created a framework that allows for others to build upon this work. From all of my aims, here are the main research contributions that have helped the field. First, we created the first ever user-independent real-time intent recognition system for both continuous and discrete estimation. Secondly, we were able to show that these models were scalable across common ambulation modes and terrain grades. And lastly, we were able to do a thorough biomechanical evaluation of these powered devices compared to passive ones. And I want to share with you guys one of my favorite videos through this experience. Although there are many challenges associated with making a device functional, whether this is from a hardware perspective or a controls, or even just ensuring that the device is safe for the user. This video here shows one of the first times that we implemented a real-time intent recognition system for detecting these different mode changes. And this smile at the end is really what makes doing this so enjoyable. However, this could not have been possible without the help of everyone. I'm truly grateful for this opportunity and the many friends that I have made along this journey. I want to thank all the committee members. I want to thank all my family and friends that have made this possible. And I want to thank everyone here that has come here and support me. And lastly, I want to thank all of our subjects for spending countless hours in our labs helping us perfect this technology. And with that, I'd like to open the floor for any questions.
Awesome stuff. So I had a question about one of the key aspects of your work was the real-time. You kind of showed that when you do these predictions, it's a pretty big difference. The accuracy. So I was wondering, what causes that difference in performance? Is the data you see in real time fundamentally something, or is it you're using different methods, different evaluations, or is it just computational patterns? What caused that difference?
Sure. So I'll talk about it from first the dependent model side. In the dependent system, you train with only that user-specific data. So you have to have a training session where you collect the data from there. And so usually we have individuals come in, we have them walk, we put the sensors on. However, this doesn't necessarily translate to when you bring them in the next time, as there could be slight differences in the impedance parameters that are tuned for comfort and fit, or as well as how the sensors are placed a little bit differently. And there could just be variations in just their walking. In the user-independent models, this tries to attempt to fix this because now you have a larger pool of this data where you can hopefully have the ability where you have these subjects fit within that variability that you collected, and then that should be able to ideally be able to kind of translate from offline to real time. And then the results I showed, that's why it was actually better for user-independent models compared to dependent.
Yeah, but I guess what I was asking was, with it, let's just take only the dependent, right? You had a difference in performance between offline and real time, right? So I guess that's what I'm asking, what is the difference?
Sure.
So, offline and real time, why would they be?
So fundamentally, the signals are different. They're not exactly the same as what you train for. In an ideal situation, they would be the same exact patterns that you would expect to see when they're walking, but everyone has this variation in walking.
Oh, so when you say offline, you mean it's tested against data collected is the same.
Correct. And that was like just a
Gotcha.
training session.
So it doesn't, okay.
Now, we've learned a lot in terms of knowing that there are certain methods that you can implement offline, but that don't necessarily translate to real time. And so there were some key things that we had to do to make sure that our offline did match our methods implemented in real time.
Okay. Thanks.
Yes?
I'm a layperson, and what I've just seen is like, there's much text. You'd expect that, but do you see any transfer of, I just had a knee replacement, over 75. I'm over 75. Do you see any transfer of that, what you're doing with prosthetics, in other areas like hips, knees, arms, as far as further study in the future?
Yeah, thank you for your question. So definitely, all of these methodologies can be applied to other types of wearable robotics. So specifically in our lab, we have people that work from a range of other devices like hip exoskeletons and knee exoskeletons, and they look to figure out the optimal control strategies to kind of reduce the burden on your intact joints. So yes, definitely taking this information that we learned from this study can definitely apply. And a lot of people have looked into implementing these user-independent strategies to make it so that it's more generalizable for a wide range of people. Yes?
Anecdotally,
So, well, first I'm going to actually thank Abdul because I can see him in the back and he was one of our participants. So can you please stand? So I'm going to let him actually be able to tell you what he felt and to see whether it kind of matches what I was able to say. Our power, yep. Thank you. Jerry, you have a question?
So from the bottom,
Yeah, so I think I've broken it down into just looking at level walking and stairs versus level walking and ramps. And definitely that is something that we want to do in our future work. There are methods that already we can develop these classifiers, whether it's been previous work or even current work. We just need to be able to have enough data to train these models in order to do that. So definitely, I really would love to do an entire circuit where you have like a time for how fast you can kind of get through it. And also just kind of making sure that we reach some of these other clinical measures, making sure that they're stable and they're able to do this quickly so that also people that would prescribe these devices can use these as measures to say that these devices actually. Yes?
talk a little bit about when, for example, like the speed colors will be good enough? Like, is there a difference in speed that is clinically meaningful to people? Like, when can we stop developing like better resolution technology for that?
Sure. So I don't think you can really notice differences between about like 0.05 to zero point 0.1 meters per second. The reason that we're really focused on trying to make these algorithms better is because we need to make sure that we can dynamically adjust, to these different profiles. And that's why really the focus for these real-time intent recognition systems were not just to do it at a steady state walking, because that's not really useful, especially when, as you're walking out, even out of this room, you're going to adjust your speed. And so you need to be able to dynamically adjust it quickly. And I think more in the like broader context, this can also be used in other devices. So it's really just figuring out which optimal set of like sensors you can do to estimate that as best. Yes. Anyone? No, I think.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I guess that's something from the. So I had a question about again on the clinical side, right? Like, so you showed all these plots that you have like errors and. So I'm wondering when you're running this in real time, obviously you don't know until you generate it, right? So do you just trust that okay, this is what my algorithm is saying? Whether it's classification or regression, you just like okay, this is algorithm, so I'm going to use the parameters, or you have like some sense of how transparent you are or whatever.
Yeah, so I'd say I think it can be broken down into like two separate sections. So from the mode classification, because we're running it in real time, it is predicting in the wrong mode. So the two most common modes are between level walking and ramp descent, and that's where the errors actually occur the most, because these profiles are very similar in terms of what you see biomechanically. And the biggest thing with these systems is that you need to make sure that this really doesn't affect the user so drastically that they stop where they're at or that they fall. And so you can use methods to try to improve, and there's been methods shown to use like time history or dynamic Bayesian networks to improve the steady state classification. That's why there was also work done to improve the delay between these transitions, to allow it to have more information to learn from before it has to make that prediction. But then in terms of like taking what you have from the intent recognition system and translating it to the device, you don't want to send a signal that is really noisy. And you want to kind of just send that in a specific portion of the gait cycle that you're interested in. And so, for example, in walking speed, we do that and we look at specifically late stance and scaling how much push-off there is as a function of.
Basically, like there's some sort of smoothing happening.
Sure, we can do a Kalman filter to improve those results, and then we can also make it so that it only updates the controller once per loop or anything. The biggest thing is making sure that it's safe and that it doesn't cause them to do anything. Yes?
I was just curious, when you were like going through the collection, was there much of an effect of like labeling for each individual on like the results that you got?
I haven't done kind of like a formal analysis on that, but definitely we do have people that range from all different sizes, like residual limb lengths. I think it's not mainly, I don't think that I can't say that it's the leg length difference that really causes this. I think it's really partially the activity level. I think we have some really active people that come in and that they can do, they have crazy stamina and endurance for walking with these devices. And I think the next step really is to see whether these devices can go towards people that are more at a lower ambulation level, like such as like K2 or K3. Yes?
You may argue nicely what kind of some of the key areas are so in terms of moving towards getting adopting more intelligent power play, what do you think are the existing like check boxes that still need to be checked off? Is it on the mechanical and hardware side? Is it on batteries and weights? Is there still a lot more work to go in the
I think all of those that you mentioned. But I think the biggest thing there really is that you have to show that these devices actually improve clinical measures. So if, let's say I have an intent recognition system and it says it's 95% accurate, I think that that's more just making sure that the device is robust to this, but I don't think that's really what matters to the user, right? As Joel mentioned, like one of the biggest things is making sure that, I'm actually offloading what I need to do on my other leg. So I think looking at more measures like gait symmetry or reduction in energy are kind of the key outcome variables that we need to look at. And all of these other improvements need to be done in respect to that. So that's how I would say to kind of approach that in terms of adopting it into the current technology. Yeah.
So it seems like one of the big takeaways is like the offline dependent thing, the air shoot does the time. And I think the inclination is that by the time the subject comes back in, for another experiment, refit the leg and everything, and I think you change the data different, the model prosthesis, air prosthesis at the time, you can mitigate that use. What was kind of shocking though is that and maybe I just the real-time user dependent and real-time user independent models, at the end of the day, have pretty similar error. Is that right?
Yeah, depending on what context we're on that, yeah.
Which suggests that there's still benefit in the user dependent data, right? Because it's a way smaller data set, right? So, go ahead.
So I guess my first thought with that is, if something changes between your training data and the next day it comes in, whatever model you've trained there is only going to be as good as the data you provided there. So I think focusing on the user independent side is better because you can include some of that variability. And if you can show that the model can work across all of that different variability seen in that data, that's actually a better, probably representation of what you would see moving forward.
So I agree, but the fact that you have like how many subjects in there?
In this one we had 10, but the real-time results were only for 6 so far.
So 10 or 6 or whatever, however many subjects, right? Multiple subjects. Train that model offline, deploy real time to get one error. Or take the one subject single session data and run that and get the same error. So is there a world where actually to get the best model, you do train subject data, but you have the subject just come with multiple days? Right? Or maybe you just literally take the leg off, refit the leg.
Yeah, I don't think that the answer is, I think the answer is actually doing something where you adapt. So you take like the baseline user independent model, and when they come in the next time, you actually feed in just a little bit of extra data that can enhance the controller. So if there is any differences or variations, that will be included in the updated model as you do. So they term that as like adaptive intent recognition.
Yeah, I think that results show that user-dependent offline studies are not good predictors of real-time accuracy. But I am hesitant to say that we should throw away.
Yeah, and I don't. I think you still need to use that in order to make sure that your algorithm's working great and that sort of thing. But I think like from the broader scope, you don't want to. The one disadvantage of using user-dependent is that you have to collect training data from that user, and that can take multiple hours every time. For user-independent or this adaptive stuff, you may only have to collect 10 to 15 extra minutes of walking before you actually have them do the rest of the task. Right. So I think really that like difference in amount of time required to do it, kind of less burden also on the user because they don't have to constantly be thinking about making sure I'm doing it correctly or the cognitive load that's on there, where it's kind of automatically doing it. Yeah.
My business. So you have training data and you have the data like for the dependent one, the training data and you have what you do. So what mode is the prosthetic in for when you're just collecting training data? Like how is it responding? How do you know that the difference isn't just that like they're responding differently because the prosthetic is different? One kind of
Yeah, so we have an initial tuning session and we set kind of the impedance parameters there. And in the 4 phases of the gate cycle, we try to tune these parameters to kind of get them the most comfortable gate that they're used to. And then we manually, in the training session, we manually like trigger them into the correct mode so that they're not doing something wrong. And because we do that, we have then the training labels or the ground truth labels in order to train these machine learning models to predict, oh, hey, this was ramp percent, this was level walking, etc. And then instead of me manually changing it on the laptop or the prosthesis, now it infers it on its own. Yes?
One thing, kind of following up on. So since there's some benefit, as you're saying, trying to keep things independent, let's say start a company, you can, just have it with your I was wondering, have you tried to look at if you can have device independent models as well? Like you have like 3 different devices. So does it matter what device the person is wearing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it does matter. And I think that's one of the nice benefits of using the second generation or the open source way, is that now multiple research universities are starting to use that device. And so any type of intent recognition strategy that we develop with these sensors can be deployed onto any other device that has it. But I think more generally, you're getting to, well, that's only for universities and the research kind of studies going there. We're hopefully going to be starting a new project where we have the OSER power need, and in there they have like certain sensors or signals that can come in, and we want to develop, if we can develop an intent recognition system that uses those sensors, there's a lot more people that use that device. And like you said, you can collect a bigger pool and then eventually just deploy that model for those individuals. So I think really it's just scaling it up and making sure that you can have a lot more people like understand also how to use power devices. Because it's not just, you can't just put it on a person and expect them to use it to the best advantage. You have to kind of train them and allow them to like trust the device. And that takes time. So you can't just immediately say, okay, hey, I'm going to throw this on here and it's going to work 100%. Yep.
Yeah, I did have another question on the biomechanics side of things.
Sure.
So you show that you run the model in real time and you can adjust the stiffness and results and keywords, I think, that were more biological. But those, so I think that's showing subject averages, right? Like average speed or whatever. If you zoom in one layer in, you look at within subjects, maybe for a single walking speed, something like that, how much variance there is in the peak torque or just in the model estimate, right? If you see like a whole bunch of jumping around the signal versus like dead on, accurate predictions, you probably see huge differences on the back end of things, actually with adaptability or mental.
Sure.
So, but right now that's kind of left to guess, I guess. Like when you average into a single value per subject. So can you speak on kind of, do you know what the or within subject variability was? Is it high, low? Does it seem like it mattered? Does it matter?
Yeah, I don't have like the exact numbers, but yeah, there is definitely more variability. One of the harder things to do with this is that you, in order to really like understand the effects, you need to collect a lot of trials. And it's already pretty hard to collect, in this case, when we did the slopes, we had them do 5 different presets at these different conditions, and that yielded only like 10 emulation circuits. So in reality, right, like whenever we're thinking about, when we look at like biomechanics, especially in like walking over like a treadmill and stuff, it's nice because you can get almost 50 to 60 steps that you can average together and look at it, but that's not necessarily the case in these more kind of real world situations where you only have like 4 or 5 steps per trial. So I think, yes, I think it's a good thing to explore, but the protocol needs to be kind of specific towards that to really look at the mechanical effects. And I think you're always going to have different users respond differently to the leg, and partially that's just them adapting to the device, but it's also on our end to make sure that we're teaching them how to properly actually use the device, right? Saying that, hey, this is how the leg is going to work. So if you put, more weight into it, that this is how it's going to push you up, right? And that's also a responsibility on our end. It's not just the adaptation on their end. Hopefully that answers.
Okay, last question.
Kind of a, talk about how you can physically for real time does. Your offline is like add relations and that will noise when hearing
The way we got around that is that actually we did what we call a sample-based method. So in real time, you know how many samples are in your buffer of whatever window that you're taking. And so then we emulated that same exact process in our offline results so that we could make a direct comparison. Because before we were doing it based off of time and saying, hey, this is 250 milliseconds before this window, but you can't say that same thing for real time. And so we had to make sure that we matched up really whatever we saw in the offline to the real time was as close as possible. So we did checks of the features to make sure that they all aligned well across all our different sensors.
Okay, great. Thanks, Christian.